CISA, the IS Audit Process, Part 1. You know, if I had my way, we would just kind of jump into my lab environment. We would get on our server, start looking at Windows 2003 and the security auditing features. We would jump into the Cisco Security Access Control Server for Windows and start looking at the different reporting capabilities, the authentication, authorization, and accounting mechanisms. We'd start looking at our syslog server and breaking down those logs and auditing different events. But you know what? We can't do that yet because we have to learn to walk before we can run. And as part of this process to achieving the Certified Information Systems Auditor certification, we want to make sure that we understand the basic functionality, the basic terminology, the basic processes. So in these first couple of real nuggets here, we're going to look at the IS audit process, and we're going to break down what you need to know from an exam standpoint, but also start giving you the tools that you need to become a successful systems auditor. Well, here it is over here on the upper left-hand corner, that Certified Information Systems Auditor Certificate. That's the goal, and we're just now starting on this journey to achieve that goal. And in part 1 of the IS audit process, we're going to cover 4 key objectives. First of all, we need to define what auditing is. What is an audit and what is an auditor? Okay, what do they do? Then we'll look at the audit planning process. We'll break this down into 8 steps. Then we'll start looking at the 2 of our first main concepts of the IS auditing process. The initial concept of risk analysis, and then what risk analysis leads to, which is the implementation of internal controls. Now, throughout the remainder of this nugget, what you're going to see is the handwriting on the wall, or my handwriting on this screen here. But what we're going to do right now is I want to give you just some basic definitions that I've printed out here that are really important for us to establish right off the bat. First of all, you know, what is an audit anyway? This whole thing about auditing and auditors, we want to kind of define these terms, as we say here in Texas, from the get-go. So an audit is an evaluation, okay? It's an evaluation, and it's an evaluation process. You're looking at an organization, or you're evaluating a particular system, in our case maybe a security system or a change configuration system. It could be an audit of an actual process, the process that's a software process or a process that involves people. Or you audit or evaluate projects or products. Now, what is an auditor? An auditor is a competent, independent, and objective person. And this is very important because the auditor typically is a third-party individual. But for many of us, we'll actually be hired by the company that we're auditing for. And that automatically creates a kind of a conflict of interest. But we are being paid and we are being called upon to be independent and as objective as possible. Once we come up with our results, we then issue a report to decision makers. Now, we're looking at IT auditing, specifically information technology or information system auditing. And this is defined as an examination of the controls within an entity, which could be an organization, a company, a customer, a client, within an entity's information technology infrastructure. Now, this used to be called an EDP audit, or an electronic data processing audit. But the IT audit is collecting and evaluating evidence of an organization's information system, of their operations and their practices, their policies and their procedures. We gather this evidence to evaluate if the organization's information systems are properly safeguarding or protecting their assets, are they maintaining data integrity, and are they operating efficiently and effectively to reach the organization's either their business goals or their nonprofit goals. Now, that is the basic idea of what an auditor does. But there's 2 types of auditors. You've got internal auditors who are employees of the company that are hired to actually assess and evaluate these IT systems or information systems. They're going to present their reports and their results directly to the board of directors or the top management, and they're expected to maintain their independence and their objectivity as part of their job goal, as part of their job description. The second type of auditor is the external auditor. The external auditors are third-party independent staff individuals that are basically hired by an auditing firm or assigned by the firm to go in and evaluate things like financial statements, information systems, network infrastructure, security policy, basically performing agreed upon evaluations between the auditing firm and the individual organization, the customer or the company. So these are four main definitions you want to have from the very beginning. What auditing is, what an auditor is, and the fact that there's two types of auditors, internal and external. Well, you've heard the old saying, if you fail to plan, then plan to fail. And throughout this CISA Nugget series, we're going to look at several different processes that apply to different technologies, different components that an auditor will audit. And of course, one of the main things you must do at the outset is to plan. It's like Abraham Lincoln said, before he's going to chop down a tree, he's going to spend 90% of his time sharpening the axe. Now, planning involves short-term planning and long-term planning, and you want to be doing this auditing process on at least an annual basis, once a year. So we're going to be looking at our short-term goals for our organization and then long-term planning. This could be a 5-year plan. Many governments, many societies and their state infrastructures will have a 5-year plan. We can do a short-term plan, which could be based on different quarters or based on a year, based on a certain amount of months. Long-term planning, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Of course, it all depends upon the business goals and the business needs. When we do this planning on at least an annual basis, what are the things we're going to take into consideration? We're going to look at new control issues. Are there any new hardware or software solutions that have been introduced into our organization where we have to think about new types of controls? For example, have you recently upgraded from a Windows 2000 to Windows 2003 environment? Have you gone from, let's say, a Windows environment to a Linux environment where you've got new types of controls? Perhaps you've added some new hardware security devices, firewall systems, intrusion prevention systems. Maybe you're changing your whole access control strategy from usernames and passwords to some type of token-based security or biometric security. All these considerations are part of the planning process. Now, I just alluded to the second aspect, changing or upgrading technology, but the first bullet point was really talking about control issues and control mechanisms. But this is overall changes to technology, okay? We want to plan for not only short-term changes or upgrades to our technology, but long-term upgrades or changes to our technology. For example, maybe we're upgrading to an IEEE 802.1x authentication mechanism, which involves authenticating and authorizing users and end systems. Next, we want to plan our auditing around the business processes, the business procedures, the needs of our business, and the goals of our business. For example, the auditing process will be totally different if we're a retailer or a manufacturer with a large amount of inventory on hand, as opposed to, let's say, a internet-based service industry that functions as a broker or a middleman. And then, of course, a big part of short and long-term planning is isolating what your auditing or your evaluation techniques are going to be. And the good news is, throughout this CISA Nugget series, we'll investigate and explore and learn about a variety of evaluation techniques that you can apply to different scenarios. And there are other considerations too. The IS auditor needs to know about major concepts like the management's approach to risk assessment, regulatory requirements and privacy issues, for example, HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley. Also consider any deadlines for implementation or upgrade to software and hardware. You'll also want to know what are the limitations of your IS resources. All of these things are going to affect the overall approach of the audit and the auditor. And obviously, planning for an audit means using a proven step-by-step process all along the way. And before you begin the actual auditing process, understand thoroughly what that step-by-step process is and what it entails. Remember, the ISACA has IS auditing standards, and it really demands that the auditor plan well for the work to make sure that you're meeting the goals and the auditing objectives, that you're complying with applicable professional auditing standards and procedures. So to perform audit planning, the IS auditor should do these steps in the following order. First of all, you need to gather data or gather information. You need to get a general understanding of the mission of the business, the business's or the organization's objectives, its purpose, and its procedures. This includes information about availability, integrity, security, and business technology. Secondly, you want to identify the stated components. These are typically in the written security policy or written policies and procedures. These are components like policies, standards, required guidelines, procedures, and the organization's structure. The third step is to perform a risk assessment, looking at any privacy impact analysis that should be led by the management or decision makers. Then, plan to perform risk analysis. We'll talk more about risk assessment and risk analysis later on in this CISA series. The fifth step is to plan for conducting an internal control review, then setting your audit scope and objectives. For example, are you just auditing the financial aspect of the organization? Are you just auditing the security policy of the organization? The seventh step in the planning process is to develop an auditing strategy or an auditing approach. Fortunately, you don't have to develop this auditing strategy in a vacuum. In this CISA series, I'll give you all the tools you need to develop this strategy. And then finally, once you've accomplished all 7 steps, you're now ready to assign the resources. This is actually personnel resources to complete the process. Let's talk more about this gather information or gather data. The IS auditor needs to gain a full understanding of the business. This is going to mean touring the key organization facilities, looking at the physical infrastructure, reading up on background materials, publications from the industry, annual reports, semi-annual reports, perhaps independent financial analysis reports. You also want to look at the short-term and long-term strategic plans. You'll want to interview key personnel, key decision makers, the CIO, key managers. You want to understand the business issues and the business needs. And obviously, you'll want to review any prior auditing reports that were done by third-party experts. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you may be under the realm of HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley. So you want to identify specific regulations, federal regs and state regs that are applicable to information technology and information systems in that organization. Now realize I've mentioned things like Sarbanes-Oxley and HIPAA, and it's important to understand the effects of laws and regulations on audit planning. But realize that the CISA candidate won't be asked about any specific laws or regulations. You might be questioned about how you would audit for compliance to laws and regulations, as I've alluded to, but you're only going to be expected to know about accepted global practices, not specifics of, let's say, HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley. The first major concept we want to cover in this IS auditing process nugget movie is the concept of risk analysis. And we've already mentioned risk assessment, and we'll get to that in a second, but realize that risk assessment is really just one of the steps of the overall risk analysis process. Risk analysis is a major aspect of auditing, and right along with risk analysis is the complementary controls or mitigation techniques that we put in place to address the risk in our organization, and we'll cover that here as well in just a second. But before we do this, let's just get some basic definitions here. Risk analysis. Here's a kind of a classic risk analysis definition. Risk analysis is a technique for identifying and assessing factors that can jeopardize a process or a goal. In our case, the process is the information technology process, the information systems process. The goals are the business goals, the business needs of the organization. Risk analysis involves implementing preventative measures, which means mitigation, countermeasures, and controls to avert the negative impact of incidents. The bottom line is this: unless you're going to plan to put into place mitigation techniques and countermeasures and controls to address this risk, then basically the analysis is for nothing. It's for naught, because obviously risk and risk mitigation go hand in hand.